The Valerians have just defeated Gis and its people, killing most and enslaving the others. With the Gis Empire gone, the Valerians begin to turn their eyes to Essos, to not only expand their empire, but to enslave people to work in their mines for resources. Some people flee, such as the Andals, to avoid being enslaved by the Valerians, but some choose to fight. This video is about the people of Rhoynar, Princess Nymeria, and their conflicts with the Valerian freehold. The Rhoynar is one of the mightiest rivers in the known world, and stretches across most of western Essos. The Rhoynar were the people that settled along the banks of this river, who named the river Mother Rhoynar. All along the river, fishers, traders, teachers, scholars, and workers in wood, stone, and metal raised elegant towns and cities. Each city, though bound through Mother Rhoynar, were independent and each had their own prince or princess, since the river folk considered women equal to men. Art and music flourished in these cities, and so did water magic. The Rhoynar were mostly prone to peace, having no interest in expanding. The river was their home, their god, and their mother. But even though they were prone to peace, the Rhoynar were skilled warriors when the need arose to fight. These warriors had silver-scaled armor, fish head helms, tall spears, and turtle shell shields. The Rhoynar claim that Mother Rhoynar spoke to them, telling them of every threat, and that the cities were protected by watery walls that could rise up and drown any enemy. Because they had no need to expand, and because of how fierce their warriors were, most people left the Rhoynar alone. When the Valerians at first reached out to the people of Rhoynar, they were accepted and welcomed. The Rhoynish priests declared that any man was welcome to the bounty of Mother Rhoynar. This proved to be a mistake. As the Valerian outposts grew into towns and cities along the river, they began to compete with the Rhoynar towns and cities. The rivalry between the cities began to grow until wars broke out. Sarmel and Valantharas were the first cities to fight after the Valerians netted and butchered one of the gigantic turtles the Rhoynar called the Old Men of the River, and who were seen as sacred consorts of Mother Rhoynar. It was dubbed the First Turtle War and lasted less than a month. Sarmel was raided and burned, but the Rhoynish water wizards called up the power of the river and flooded Valantharas, washing half the city away. After this war, many followed, including the War of the Three Princes, the Second Turtle War, the Fisherman's War, the Salt War, the Third Turtle War, the War on Dagger Leg, the Spice War, and many more. Cities and towns were destroyed, burned down, drowned in water, and rebuilt as thousands were enslaved or killed. These wars were a bit unfair though. While each Rhoynar prince or princess fought along with their city, the Valerian colonies aided one another, and sometimes even the freehold became involved. So more often than not, the Valerians were the victors in the war. These conflicts would stretch out for the best part of 2.5 centuries. Finally, the Second Spice War occurred, where 3 Valerian dragon lords joined with others in Volantis to sack and destroy Sarhoy, the great Rhoynar port city. The city was burned down, the warriors of Sarhoy were slaughtered, and their children enslaved. The Valerians then sowed their lands with salt, so that the Sarhoy could never rebuild there again. The other Rhoynar princes, shocked at one of the richest and most beautiful cities being destroyed, declared they must band together and destroy every Valerian city on the river. "We shall all be slaves unless we join together to end this threat," declared the greatest of them, Garin O'Coriain. Princess Nymeria of Nysar spoke against this route, claiming they couldn't win a war against the Valerians. The others disagreed with her, and Nymeria was forced to join the alliance. At Coriain, the largest army that Essos had ever seen gathered under the command of Prince Garin. Prince Garin claimed that as long as they fought alongside the river, their water wizards would protect them against the fires of the Valerian dragons. Every man of fighting age took up sword and shield and followed Prince Garin. Garin divided his army into 3 parts. One marched down the east bank of the Rhoynar, one along the west, and the last took a large fleet of war galleys down the river that kept pace between the 2 armies and destroyed any enemy ship that got in their way. Garin marched and destroyed every village, town, and outpost in his way. He won 2 victories, but then at Valantharas, he also won, but at great cost. There had been 100,000 enemies, 100 war elephants, and 3 dragon lords waiting for him. In the end, thousands were burned by the dragonfire before Rhoynish archers could kill 2 of the dragons and force the 3rd dragon to flee. The water wizards raised enormous water spouts, and finally Mother Rhoynar rose up and swallowed Valantharas. After this victory, Garin was called Garin the Great, and in Volantis people began to fear Garin's advance. Instead of facing him, Volantis called for the freehold to help them. The freehold answered, and 300 dragons came to aid Volantis against Garin and his army. People rushed into the river, while tens of thousands of men burned, only to then be drowned in the waters. Some people believe the dragonfire even caused the river to boil and water to steam. Garin was captured and forced to watch his people suffer. The Rhoynish warriors were killed by the sword, and Garin himself was placed in a golden cage to watch as Sarmel was sacked and then Prince Garin's own city destroyed. His cage was hung from a wall, and he was forced to watch the destruction of his city and the enslavement of women and children. But as he watched, Garin cursed the conquerors, and that night Rhoynar flooded out of season, and the Valerian conquerors began to die of grayscale. Princess Nymeria heard of this defeat and knew her city and people were next. Instead of fighting, she gathered every ship that remained and filled them with women and children. Almost all the men of fighting age had marched with Garin and were now dead. Nymeria led her fleet down the river past floating corpses and burned towns, taking an older channel to avoid Volantis. She then emerged in the summer sea where Sorahoi used to be. And the tale claims that she had 10,000 ships, which maesters disagree about. She most likely had a great number of ships, but most were river crafts, skiffs, pull boats, trading galleys, fishing boats, and even rafts, their decks and holds crammed full of women, children, and old men. Only 1 in 10 were even remotely seaworthy. Nymeria began her voyage to find a new home for her people. More than 100 ships would sink in the first storm, and others would turn back in fear only to be enslaved. Others would fall behind or drift away, never to be seen again. The remainder of her fleet sailed across the summer sea to the Basculus Isles, stopping there to get fresh water and provisions. Unfortunately, the kings of Axe Isle put aside their fighting and attacked Nymeria's people, setting 40 of the ships on fire and taking hundreds of her people into slavery. The kings in the end agreed to give the Rhoynar the Isle of Toads, but only if they gave up their boats and sent each king 30 virgin girls and pretty boys each year as tribute. Nymeria refused this offer and went back to sea, heading to the jungles of Southros. They settled at Basculus Point, with others spreading out nearby. Nymeria herself remained with the ships at Zemetar, a Gis colony abandoned for 1,000 years. Some still made their ways up to the ruins of Yen, haunted by ghouls and spiders. Although there were gems, rare woods, exotic pelts, fruits, spices, and gold, the Rhoynar weren't built to handle the wet heat and the swarms of stinging flies that spread disease such as green fever, the dancing plague, blood boils, weeping sores, and sweet rot. The river was infested with carnivores and tiny worms that laid their eggs in the flesh of swimmers. Eventually, too, the new towns on Basculus Point were raided by slavers, and Yen was attacked by ghouls of the jungle. The Rhoynar struggled to survive in Southros for over a year, until a boat arrived at Yen to find that every man, woman, and child had vanished overnight. Nymeria gathered her people and went to sea again. For 3 years, the Rhoynar sailed and wandered through the southern seas trying to find a new home. On the Isle of Butterflies, the people there gave them a home, but the Rhoynar began to die by some mortal illness, forcing them to retreat back to the ships. In the Summer Isles, they settled on a rock off the eastern shore of Wallano, which became known as the Isle of Women. But the stony soil couldn't yield the necessary food, and many of Nymeria's people starved. Nymeria ordered her people back to the ships, but some didn't follow her. A priestess began to tell the Rhoynar that she heard Mother Rhoynar calling them back home. The priestess and her followers headed back to their old cities, but their enemies were waiting, and they were either slain or enslaved. The remainder of Nymeria's ships that didn't go with the priestess sailed west to Westeros. Some ships were blown off course by storms and made their way to Tyrosh or Lys, giving themselves up to slavery. And some landed on the Stepstones, where people to this day claim they are descended from those shipwrecked there. The rest of Nymeria's fleet finally arrived in Dorne near the mouth of the River Greenblood, close to the Sand Ship, the seat of House Martell, tattered and barely afloat. At this time, Dorne was a poor land, with lords and petty kings warring over every stream, river, well, and fertile land. A majority of Dornish lords viewed the Rhoynar as an unwelcome people, and wanted to drive them back into the sea. But Mors Martell, the Lord of Sandship, saw an opportunity in the Rhoynar, and some claim he fell in love with Nymeria, a beautiful, fierce warrior queen that led her people across the world to be free. 8 out of every 10 Rhoynar were women, with the boys who had started the journey with Nymeria now men, and a quarter of them warriors. Mors Martell married Nymeria, and hundreds of his knights, squires, and lord bannermen also wed the Rhoynish women, or took them as paramours. To celebrate the union, and to make sure that her people never fled to the sea again, Nymeria burned the Rhoynish ships. Nymeria claimed, "Our wanderings are at an end. We have a new home, and here we shall live and die." Some of the Rhoynar mourned the loss of the ships, and rather than embracing their new land, they took to plying the waters of the Greenblood, finding it a pale shadow of Mother Rhoynar. The Martells joining with Rhoynar increased the size of his people by tenfold. The Rhoynar also brought their own wealth with them. Their artisans, metalworkers, and stonemasons brought skills far more advanced than those in Westeros. The Rhoynish also had water witches that used secret spells to make dry streams flow again and deserts bloom. Princess Nymeria named Mors Martell Prince of Dorne in the Rhoynish style, and claimed he had dominion over the red sands and the white, and all the lands and rivers from the mountains to the Great Salt Sea. Years of war followed her declaration, as as the Martells and Rhoynar fought one king after another, eventually sending 6 conquered kings to the wall. The greatest of their enemies was Yorick Urawnwood, and they fought with him for 9 years. Mors Martell eventually fell in the Third Battle of the Boneway at Yorick's sword, causing Nymeria to command his armies. 2 years later, Nymeria forced Yorick to bend the knee, and then she ruled thereafter from Sunspear. Nymeria married twice more, first to the Lord of Hellholt, and next to Sir Davos Dane of Starfall, the Sword of the Morning. But Nymeria remained the unquestioned ruler in Dorne for almost 27 years. She survived dozens of assassination attempts, put down 2 rebellions, and stopped 2 invasions by the Storm King Doran III, and one by King Graydon of the Reach. When Nymeria died, her eldest daughter by Mors Martell succeeded her, since Dorne had adopted the laws and customs of the Rhoynar, where women were equal to men. Come back next Wednesday for a random light Game of Thrones video, or Sunday for Aegon the Conqueror.